All right, we're going to get started in a few minutes. If you want to go ahead and get your seats. Yes.
So, thank you.
I need to stay away.
The fine dining experience.
Even though ADs don't play favorites, especially when I control them. He's got I'm ready.
All right, everybody, we're going to get started.
Isn't it? Yep. Ready.
If you're not here for Deprive, get the hell out. Stephen, sit down. All right, good morning, everybody. Welcome to the DPRIVE working group. I'm Brian. This is Tim. We're your illustrious hosts for today. So, quick run through of who we are and what we're doing.
Who are you?
I'm a troublemaker.
What are you doing?
I don't know.
I'm the voice of reason.
So first of all, we did have a slight leadership changeover this week. So first things first, I'd like to welcome Eric to the zoo.
Stand up and take a bow.
Anything that Tim and I do that you don't like, talk to him.
Yep.
And second of all, Mr. Manderson, please stand up.
Yes.
We want to thank Terry for his illustrious leadership over the last 4 years. We understand that we are his favorite working group.
Yep.
So, but we also appreciate all the help that he's given us. So thanks, Terry.
Thank you.
Quick other administrative notes. Dan York is our illustrious Jabber scribe. So he'll be jumping in front of the line for anybody who has questions there. And Mr. Hoffman, there's Paul. Paul has graciously agreed to take minutes for today. So I think we are covered from that.
And please remember to speak your name at the mic so Paul can find you. Yes.
If not, Warren will beat you for him.
Yeah.
Note well, if you've been here for more than 30 seconds, you've seen this. Make sure that you follow it. Blue sheets have started around. I believe Suzanne started the passage, so please sign those so that we know what size room we need and we're not either cramped on top of each other or yelling at each other from 5 miles away the next time we meet. Agenda. First thing, we're going to run through the agenda, make sure we got the blue sheets going. The first order of business is going to be the discussions of our stage 2 work. We have a nice long 30-minute discussion about the material that's been collected since the interim meeting. So that's going to be the first order of business. Second one is going to be some new working group business that we want to go over. As far as that goes, we have some updates from the 7626 biz work, as well as the BCP op. And then new things coming down the pike. We have some discussions on a BCP for DO clients, using DOT for insecure delegations, and how to bootstrap the DNS servers. Does anybody have any changes or modifications to the agenda that they would like to propose? All right. Then we will move on to the discussion of the requirements for phase 2. Alex.
And Benno. Yep.
And Benno.
Hi, morning everybody. Benno, myself, and William got together and worked on something that should cover one of the milestones, the so-called unpublished document. So the purpose of this talk is to give you like a little bit of a background. We have a couple of questions that we have collected, and after that, we really want to go into a discussion of how to proceed with this document. So just to give you a background of that, the DPRIVE charter actually contains a work item that says develop requirements for adding confidentiality to DNS service, and that is supposed to be an unpublished document. Yeah, so we have taken the decision to put it into the put it actually on a GitHub page. So during IETF, as you remember, the DPRIVE working group session got cancelled, so there wasn't any chance to discuss that. We created a wiki document first that that was moved to a GitHub repository, and so there was a review of that first version of that collection of text at the DPRIVE interim, and a couple of updates came in since that interim meeting. So, brief overview. Can I ask how many people have actually read that one? A few. Okay. So I'm gonna give you a quick run about what the document is about. So we are actually listing existing and previous work. That includes previous work from the DPRIVE group as well as work from other groups. We came up with the idea that the requirements actually come from three different perspectives. So one is the user requirement, the user perspective. That user might have a different requirement than the other perspectives, where the other requirements are the operators, be it both recursive resolvers as a client and authoritative name servers as the servers. And yet another perspective on requirements is the software vendor implementer. Furthermore, down the document, we have a functional breakdown of, I would say, that DPRIVE phase 2 area into those functional components. So there's text about the privacy protection mechanism. Something that's of course more trickier here than with phase 1 is the authentication, with concerns or text about performance and efficiency. And some things that came up during the discussion. One is the detection of availability. So how does a server actually find out that an authoritative server provides DPRIVE enabled protocols, I would say. And something interesting, the end user policy propagation. So how does the stop resolver user actually find out whether the upstream connection between the recursive resolver and the authoritative servers were encrypted or not? Yeah, this is important. We're gonna come back to that afterwards. So the current status it's more like a description of options. It's not really a hard requirements document. So we essentially put all the text in that we could think of, and it doesn't say like a server must, a client may, a client ought to, and so the overarching question is how shall we proceed with this document? Yesterday we talked about this a little bit, and we found out there are three essential questions that I'm going to talk about in a minute. But first, of course, please review that one. Yeah, please comment on it. You can actually like submit a pull request if you want text added or changed. So going further to the three questions. So the question number one to the group is, as I said before, the document is currently rather a description of options and what functional areas do we need to consider to work on, rather than a hard list of requirements. Yeah. So question number one is, shall we modify the document to list hard requirements? So musts and shoulds. If yes, what are these requirements, obviously? Yeah, so that's the first thing I would propose to discuss. The second question that we came up with, are we actually set with DOT as the transport protocol? The document lists the transport protocol choice as one of the dimensions of the design space, yeah, and DOT is baked, as we all know. There are a couple of other options, as we all know as well. So the question to the group is, do we want to be settled on DNS over TLS as the transport protocol of choice between recursive resolvers and authoritative servers? If yes, do we need any changes to DOT as it stands, besides a new profile for authentication, of course? If DOT is not the protocol of choice, then what else do we use? Question number 2. And question number 3 is the whole area of end-user signaling. So the idea about that is, currently the properties of the upstream connections between recursive resolvers and authoritative servers are opaque to the user. So the user doesn't actually know whether his upstream connections were encrypted or not. In many other places, such a similar proxying, I would say, takes place. For example, if you submit your message via SMTP to someone, that server might or might not use encryption when they transmit it to the destination server. So it's a very similar problem to other problems, to similar problems in other protocols. So question number 3 is, do we actually want or need signaling to the stop resolver, whether all upstream communication was previously enabled? It's not an easy problem, I think, because if you think about how many upstream servers might be contacted for a single recursion, let me put it that way, there's all the question of aggregation and that, and also the more complicated questions of how do you actually present it to the user? How do you get it through the API to the actual human? But that's the third question. So I think that's it from my side with regards to the introduction to that document or the problem space. And I think we should spend a bit of time to discuss this. I have listed the 3 questions here on the final slide. And also, are there any other questions that we haven't touched upon? Yeah.
Thanks, Alex. So what we want to do is we want to focus on one question at a time. We have 25 minutes of time to do this. So what I would suggest is we're going to go back to question 1, and people who have comments or follow-ups on question 1, let's get those through, and then we'll move on to question 2, question 3, and then we'll solicit any questions that people think we might be missing. So let's start with the question on hard requirements.
Yeah, I'm going to come back to questions. Yeah. So the question is, the document currently doesn't list any hard requirements, although the milestone in our charter says requirements document. So where do we get those? Daniel, thanks.
Hi there. This is Daniel Kahn-Gilmore, ACLU. So it's not clear to me whether this question is, should we put in shoulds or musts, or what should those shoulds and musts be, right? And I suspect that there are people around this room with different opinions on what they should be if we decide to make those changes. So, but I'm also a little bit unclear on, right, if this is the unpublished document, when we say, it's published, right. The scope of the question here is a little bit odd. So I certainly have opinions about what I would like to see in the document, and there's some of the things that will be musts or shoulds, but not all of them will be, right?
So and that's what we would like to hear is what you would like to see in the document in relation to requirements, and to what degree are those hard requirements or nice to have types of things.
So are you asking specifically what do I think should be a must, or are you asking do I think there should be a must?
Both. Voice your opinion on what you think should be in there and to what degree you want them in there.
And to be clear, it's currently a GitHub document, so it has no status, but we also have to discuss that maybe. But please go on.
This is like a very strange kind of meta discussion here.
Yeah.
So I'm struggling with it a little bit. I mean, I would say that, for instance, an authoritative name server that offers private queries must be valid, must have its identity validated, and we would list a specific way that the validation would work, right? I would want there to be an authenticated way to do that. right? So that's like the authentication should be a must. What specific type of authentication, I don't know, because we would need to sort that out. But like that's an example. Like I would want there to be a way to have a strict opt-in.
I think part of the, I'm leaving that up to the chairs, but I think the reason why we actually decided that would be an unpublished document is we didn't want to hold up actual protocol development from a requirements document that lingers around 2 years. Yeah, but I think we could also discuss that.
We can discuss that too.
Daniel is of course right that if we put a must into an unpublished document, it's actually me.
Kind of standard C. Yeah. So, Stephen and then Mr. Joe.
Stephen Farrell. So I don't care if you use 2119 language or not. You could do other things like just move bits of text down the end and say this used to be, or this is something we kind of discarded. So we don't have to say a bunch of things. And then I need to go reread the document to see which specific ones I'd have strong opinions on, which I'll do in a minute. But I think generally I understand DKG's point, but I think some more towards encouraging things that are easily deployable at this stage, I think would be a better overall thrust in terms of the requirements, that rather than trying to be aimed towards more strict authentication, for example. So in general, I think that's the direction I would think it might be better.
I think that's also the reason we want to be a little bit careful here and not like describe the unicorn that we can actually then not implement.
Yeah.
Joe Abley, PIR. I think the important thing is that the requirements actually be useful as requirements. I don't think you're writing this document just because the milestones say you have to. I think you're writing it for a reason. So I think it's a great idea actually to not focus on just whittling this down to death and taking 2 years to come up with something that can go through the process before you start any other work, because that's absurd.
Yep.
But although it is a bit of a shame if it's not ultimately published somewhere, because I think it would be nice to record the decisions. But I think this question of should they be hard requirements, I think they should just be useful requirements, and the language you use is not that important. But if they're not useful, then don't have the document. It's a waste of time.
So Joe, just to kind of address the publication question, I think these will end up in a document somewhere that gets published, whether it's a standalone document or like an appendix to whatever comes out is probably what will end up happening.
Yeah, I think that would be good.
Hi, Carl Henderson, VeriSign. I guess the question's a little puzzling to me because what do shoulds and must mean in an unpublished document?
Could you speak a little closer?
Sorry. What's confusing to me is what do musts and should mean in an unpublished document?
Yeah, that's the loophole that we just discovered. Yeah. We didn't think of it yesterday.
Hey, this is Sean Turner. I think I kind of agree with Stephen. I mean, it's a style thing. You can decide to put musts and shoulds in or not. That's all how you want to write the document. You can write RFCs, or you can write internet drafts that become RFCs that don't include 2119 language that are still standard Strack. I mean, Mail did that basically, right? So.
Okay.
Watson Ladd, I think that this is really a question about we should be prioritizing some of the requirements. There's some requirements in there that are must-haves for certain communities. There are some in there that are nice-to-haves. There are some in there that, it would be good if it happened, but we don't really care. And I think some form of distinguishing is definitely needed.
Priorities. Yeah.
And Stephen's comment about something to deploy now kind of fits into that must-have now, be nice to have down the road kind of thing, right? Yep.
Weber Akamai. So I was a bit confused earlier that because we had later in the session, I think, document that are addressing the solution space on that, and having a requirement section already. I understand it now. One of the things that I want to say for me would be, well, must, should, whatever, is we've done sort of lots of efforts in having DNS secured, so having the data in DNS secured, and we should, I think, utilize that to aid that protocol that we come up there.
Yeah. I have to agree with you that essentially in a beautiful, perfect world, the requirements should be done before there are actually any solutions, so that we can evaluate the solutions against the requirements. That's not the case here. That's why I'm careful about, do we actually need to go that far, or do we all have the requirements in our head anyways? And if that is the case, can we simply write them down in 5 minutes? Yeah. Okay, so shall we move on to the second question? Yeah, sure. So second question is like a pretty simple one, actually. Are we set with DOT? Yeah. Or DOT?
Paul Hoffman, yes.
Just breaking the mic. Sarah Dickinson, I'm not sure I understand this. Are you saying you would hard limit the set of protocols that you would consider by setting a requirement? Is the requirement we will use no other protocol except dot?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's the decision. Do we say we are set, we're happy with what we have, or do we want to go out and explore for a year? Yeah. I'm biased a little bit, as you can hear, but.
So, yeah, I'm confused what the requirement would be. Are you looking for the opposite requirement? We would actively look at other protocols. Is that the proposal?
Yes, that might be a better formulation. Yeah, indeed.
In which I would say, yes, but it's not one of the immediate requirements.
Yeah,
but absolutely on the longer term, I don't think you want to be discounting any protocol here because who knows what's going to come out of the woodwork, right?
Yeah. No, thank you. Yeah, I think your formulation is much better than ours. Yeah, thank you.
Carl
Please
Henderson,
send text.
VeriSign.
Oh, yeah,
Yes.
Please send text, Sarah.
Hello, Peter van Dijk, Power DNS. I like dot. I like dot a lot. But what's more important to me is that we don't do a lot of probing, nothing opportunistic protocol-wise, because I don't want my resolver spending seconds figuring out what protocol to speak to somebody. So whatever we do, make it discoverable without pain. Thank you.
And I also understand you say make it just a potential choice between a small set of protocols. Yeah. I think about.
Well, yeah, as an implementer, yes.
Yeah.
Manu Brotel. Dot is being tried at the moment, and I think it's the low-hanging fruit that we can go with at least. You know, the future may tell that we can start using something else, but instead of making it overcomplicated and have big dreams, let's get going with something that is available.
Eric Klein, I think we'll end up needing some kind of mandatory to implement minimum. Dot seems perfectly fine for me, but I don't see that it necessarily precludes other things as long as they meet general privacy and security requirements.
Yeah, okay.
And Eric Nygren, plus one to those, but I think, and especially agreeing with the making sure that if we want to go to something like DNS over quick, it doesn't become something that requires lots of probing and such, and there's a clear way to negotiate to it.
Puneet from Google Public DNS, and as a starting point, DNS over TLS seems like the right thing because the protocol has been demonstrated to work.
Okay, cool.
Oh, Watson, you really don't want to design your own encrypted transport protocol at this point. Please just use TLS, and if that stops working, then we can start thinking about ways to fix it.
Yep, duly noted. I've been to SEG once or twice, so. Yeah. Okay, fair enough. So I think that's pretty clear. We want to go ahead with DOT, but we don't want to preclude any potential future protocol. Yeah, if that's what the understanding is. And if we go there, we actually want to consider the implementer's perspective that probing through 23 different protocols might be unfeasible to implement. Yeah. Peter.
No probing at all, please.
Okay.
Not 23, not one. Just find out some other way, like signaling from the parent or
okay,
if possible.
Yeah. We're going to note that as implementer perspective requirement. Yeah.
Petr Špaček, CZNIC. I totally agree with Peter. No probing at all, just some sensible signaling, please.
Okay. Okay, cool. Third question, end user signaling. That's not a fluffy topic. Yeah. Do we want to think about ways or protocols to convey the privacy status of the upstream connections to the stop resolver?
Daniel Kahn-Gilmore from ACLU. Well, I think this is a really interesting question. I think it's second order, and I don't want it to distract from actually getting the linkages working. So I would say put this off.
Okay.
Manu Brotel. Yeah, I agree. I mean, this is really nice to have, I guess, but this is going to be super complicated.
I know, yeah.
So Stephen Farrell, I agree with the two previous speakers. I think it would be a useful thing for people to think about and consider, but keep way off any critical path. So I wouldn't like to say you can't talk about it, but I'm entirely happy that we don't try and do it now.
It shouldn't be on the critical path.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Eric Klein, I also sort of question its usefulness because if we have this, then do we have to have a signal that says whether or not queue name minimization was used during the process as well? You know, and you know, insert other $ new privacy feature.
It could like grow pretty quickly into a generic signal to the client, whatever you like to do. Yeah.
Hi, Peter Lexus Powerdines. +1 to the consider it, but don't make it big topic for the first draft.
Okay.
I do have a question about the end user signaling. What would the end user do with this information in the end? I mean, the question has already been asked anyway to the internet. So what is the use case here?
I think it would depend on the client, but my personal imagination would be mixed into something that's like a green padlock somewhere in some place in some app. I don't know. Right now.
Christian Wiedemer. Well, please keep it simple. I mean, this end user signaling, the end user has no way to verify that the server is not bullshitting it.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's basically useless.
It's like the security bit.
Joe Abley, PIR, and I think that's all sensible. But the one thing that is interesting that is not there is, should there be an opportunity for a client to indicate that they want privacy and say discard the query if you can't offer it? And it's, again, not guaranteed, but it's a signal.
You already know that, yeah. Interesting point, yeah. We can.
So Joe, before you run away, or
to Joe's point, I mean, most of the queries that the client gets coming out of the cache. So if what would be the point in requiring security? It's absurdly hard within a recursor to find out what the state was when you entered and then what is the state when you exited. Because there are tons of recursions going on all the time, and some are secure, some are not. And I mean, this is a bit to the signaling itself is very hard, but finding out is near impossible.
Yeah.
Just to clarify, I wasn't suggesting it was easy or sensible.
Yeah.
You write the code?
Matt Poundset. Maybe I'm not understanding something here, but I would have thought that end user signaling would be a thing that was useful between the stub and the application rather than between the recursor and the stub. Because wouldn't this be the stub saying, yes, I got my answer over TLS? Why would the application not trust that?
I think it would affect both levels, actually. Both legs of what you just mentioned, both from the resolver to the stub, from the recursor to the stub resolver, and from the stub resolver to the user. Yeah. That makes it even more complicated. Yeah.
Wes Herdeker, ASI. So in the HTTPS world, where we do have signaling and the green lock and all that kind of stuff, the point is that the user knows that they, can safely hit submit next time, although they don't actually check the link, so that's a whole other thing. The reality is, in something like this, it's more like saying you just released your privacy, right? It's too late. The signaling occurs after you've already disclosed what you've done. So I'm not sure that there's a whole lot to be done there. It is true with the green lock too, yes.
Which goes in line with what Joe said, that we would probably rather think about something where the user requests previously enabled upstreams.
Daniel Kahn-Gilmore. So signaling to the user, in whether it's the user signaling to the service of what they want or signaling back to the user of what the result was, is a super complicated problem. It's a complicated problem when the user is only talking to one party. In this case, we have a user talking to one party that's then talking to another party. Actually, they might be talking to half a dozen parties. It may have talked to those parties in the past. So I just want to point out that the signaling that we're talking about here is extremely complicated. And something that we have failed to do successfully in other contexts here at the IETF, where it's much simpler. So I really think we shouldn't rat hole on it.
Yep.
Dan York, employed by the Internet Society, but not speaking for them. I agree with what DKG just said. I think we should personally, I think we should really look at how, I don't know that the end users are really going to care. We've seen this right now, right? And look, we're removing some of the signaling from some of the other places that are out there, in different ways. I think we really have to study whether anybody's actually going to do anything with this, or if it just becomes more overload for what's in. And on that note, I think we should involve the people who would actually implement said signaling, so that, asking the browser vendors, if we gave you this signal, would you do anything with it, for instance? Because if nobody's going to actually use it, right, I think you're going to say that, right? If nobody's going to use it, then don't bother. Let's move on to the next item.
I suggest to move to more technical topics, because we can waste any amount of time on discussion about signaling, but without actually having the protocol, we are not going to signal anything useful anyway. So we as DNS resolver implementers badly need a mechanism to signal that the authoritative side, or the other side, understands some secure transport protocol. So I would suggest to focus on this, otherwise we will not get anything deployed anyway.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not far. This is Elliot Lear. I'm not far off from what he just said, but I did want to add that I think there's an overarching question here that the IAB should look at. I mentioned this to Stephen, which is what sort of end user signaling is actually useful in a more systemic way, and that could feed back to you. But I think it would be premature to go there now, and it's a research topic actually.
Yeah. Cool. Yeah.
Eric Scorley, I don't know can't imagine what a client would do with the signal if it had it. There's like, I want to like, the piece of information that would be useful, which you already do get sometimes, is like this is like DNSSEC validated or something, but like that's not what we're getting here. So I can't imagine anything you could do contingent on that. What I would suggest is that as Bill suggested, we put this down, and if someone comes up with some useful reason why what thing you do with the signal, then you can revisit the question of the signal.
Yep.
Brian Dixon. I think this dovetails with policy discovery and or other kinds of discovery, and the signaling, I think, needs to be to the application, not to the user, to some degree. Yeah, at least in terms of supporting certain environments such as the enterprise. I think it's an area that's complicated, but I think there's a lot of potential to find solutions, and I'm definitely committed to participating in that and contributing ideas.
Thank you.
Sarah Dickinson. One other thing to consider is, I think that what seems to be the more useful signal is one the client can send to the recurser to say, please don't do this query if you can't guarantee you're going to do it over a private channel. Obviously, you can't enforce that the recurser honors that, but we have something similar with the DNS client subnet where the client can at least say, please don't forward my IP. So I don't think that's a simpler problem, but I think that's more useful to the client.
Yeah, understood. Cool. Thanks. I think that was really good because we got quite good answers on all the questions.
Let's jump to the other side where we want to find out if there are other questions that people want.
Other questions not touched upon.
So for the last couple of minutes, do people have important questions that they think we need to consider when we're doing this work that Alex and Benno have not articulated yet? We've got 3 key ones, but everybody always seems to have their own little interesting questions, and here's your chance to bring them up now.
My takeaway before was that the implementers really want something that prevents them to probe. Yeah. So they want signaling that in some way that they can start away with right away with an encrypted session.
Hi, Stephen Farrell. So I'm not sure if it fits here. Maybe it's somewhere else in the agenda, or you want to do it later, which is all of which is fine. But at what point do we want to try and figure if our goal is to be strict or opportunistic?
Yep.
That's a question for the chairs, I guess.
Yep. Makes it easier for me.
There are pieces of the work that people want to do and have proposed that we need to figure out how they fit in with this, what we think is going to be the right solution. So I believe that some of the answers to your question will come up in later discussions.
Okay, so the answer is later.
Yeah.
Great.
Okay, thanks everybody.
Oh, and we were going to say, if you have text or comments, use the GitHub, send pull requests. We're more than welcome to process them. So.
And if you're allergic to GitHub, you can send comments via email.
Yeah, and we'll
So-
put them in for you.
Can we stop on that one for a moment?
Okay.
I'm going to wear my hat as the Git working group chair.
Oh, yeah.
You two just said things that will cause comments to appear in two places and people not to see some.
Okay.
I will now, taking off my hat, can we just have comments on the mailing list? I don't think we need to track in two places.
You good with that?
That's fine. It's up to the working group. So we started with the wiki, then it was proposed to move it to the GitHub because it was more easy to track changes and to contribute to a document. But primarily it's what's best fit with the working group. So how does the working group want to interact with this document? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I've done this repeatedly. GitHub issues are extremely convenient. I'm not sure why Paul doesn't want to do them, yeah, like I don't. It seems like a perfectly legitimate way to report issues with the document. Just put them on GitHub issues.
So the move to the GitHub was also after the interim meeting, and from the request from the participants from the WebEx meeting, I can imagine that we kind of update also on the mailing list that has been edits on the GitHub repository to keep people informed and that point their attention to the document.
So, I mean, we can also gladly create an internet draft. We saw that at that point of the development of that document, it would be easier to have something that's more dynamic than an internet draft that goes on to revision 76, 77, 78. But we're open to that. Yeah.
So Stephen Farrell, I think I got to agree with Paul. So what I would suggest, I mean, I think there's been one PR and 0 issues on this. I just had a quick look.
Correct.
And there's been a bunch of discussion on the list. So editorial changes, work away in GitHub, that's just fine. Keep the text in GitHub. Keep any non-editorial discussion on the list. That would be my argument.
Okay.
Yeah, I feel I wanted to echo that. I mean, the discussion and all the changes that go in there have to happen on the mailing list because that's what we are using, not GitHub.
Yeah, fair enough.
Dan York, Internet Society, but speaking as myself, is this going to become a draft at some point? Because we're...
So what we mentioned earlier, Dan, is that at some point, probably at a minimum, either the requirements are going to be published as a standalone document or published as an appendix to whatever solution document we put forth. So this document is really just to collect all of the key things that we want to focus on, and then we can decide which ones need to be included in a published RFC.
Okay, I just, from the way that we've worked, just kind of wrapping my brain around a different way of working, because we've always worked in this group with drafts, and now we're working with a document that's not really a draft, and we're working through that to go and formulate that. So I'm just...
Yeah, I understand. So yeah, it's something, our first, that was an idea we got after the Bangkok non-meeting, but we had some discussions with the chairs and the two, and at least collect some ideas from the mailing list. So this document is also kind of an inventory of the discussions on the mailing list, and at least place everything together, structure it with some questions the chairs also ask. What is the user's perspective? What is the operator perspective? And to start a discussion. And I'm fine to move it in any place, on any form, for the working group. But this is kind of kickstarting this discussion here we have here now. Have kind of some structure to think about and organize our work for the next.
So I guess my only comment would be for somebody who is not following this group or who wants to know what we're doing in this group, this is now a stealth document because it's not in Data Tracker, it's not in anywhere that anybody would know unless they happen to follow this. So I just think from a transparency point or something to know what this group is doing, it might be good to submit something as a draft now.
Yeah.
Just so it's at least on record, and it could just say at the top of it that, you know, this document is being iterated over at GitHub, you know, go there and be part of that.
I think that was my personal conclusion, what Paul and Ecker said, something fine to track changes on GitHub, but
yeah, I mean, I think GitHub's a great way to do this with some of it, with the issue tracker and the pieces are there, but I think there ought to be some linkage from this group's pages or something over to where the discussion is actually going.
So let me see if I can simplify this a little bit. We don't want this document to be a gating factor for some of the other documents. So that's why we made it just a scratch working group document as a good beginning point. If people want to see it as an internet draft, we can do that. It's not that hard. The other thing I can do is we can sit down with the secretariat and just have it add a link to the charter page so that everybody knows that this is where to find the working document. I'm happy doing it either way.
Please make it internet draft. The working documents, it's fine. They're cheap, extremely cheap. And then then people know how to find the things for the working group. They know how to when they download the agenda, they can just download everything for the working group. I don't think that conflicts in any way with using GitHub for to develop iterations of the draft, but please do publish a draft. Thank you.
+1.
Okay. Thank you.
Duly noted. So I get that as we shall convert that into an internet draft. Yeah. Fair enough. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Which one is it? It is
Sarah?
I am looking for, there we go.
Yeah.
Yep.
That's the op.
Oh, you want the viz?
Yeah.
Yes, please.
Yes. Okay. There you go. Hold on. There we go.
Okay. Okay, cool. So there's two drafts I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to start with the 7626 biz, which is a rev of the privacy considerations document. So the original document was actually published back in 2015, and it was the first document to come out of DPRIVE. And in the abstract, it said that it documented the privacy issues associated with the use of the DNS by internet users. So there's a couple of things with hindsight to note about this. One is that it is very specifically limited to privacy. It does not talk about security or trust models or how users choose which resolver to use. It was simply a snapshot that was based on the way DNS was deployed and used at the time, so 3.5 years ago. And as we all know, that has changed quite a bit. We're doing the biz because since then we have had multiple standards, both in DPRIVE and in DO. So we're no longer in the world where all DNS goes over clear text, so things have changed. Alongside that, we have the second draft that I'll talk about today, which is the best current practices for operators who offer privacy services. When we were developing that draft, we ended up basing it on a model where we describe the threats to users, and then we describe mitigations that operators can provide. And we wanted to use the 7626 as the basis of the threat description, in other words, a problem statement. So it felt like the right thing to do was to update 7626 and add new threats from new protocols that were available, and then reference that from the BCP so that we had these two companion documents, one with threats in, one with mitigations in. So the status of the biz is that it was first published in July 2018. We did an update at the beginning of this year, but only with very minor updates compared to the first version. And a call for adoption started yesterday or the day before. So thank you to everybody who's already commented on the list. Please take a look and add your comments to that too. A very brief survey of what is new in the biz compared to the original document in the current version of the biz. So we added work on DOT and DO that's in there, and included those as transports that users can use. You wouldn't believe how many references have changed in 3 years. We added a section talking about threats due to PII inside the DNS payload. We talked about attacks on encrypted transports and the potential that encrypted transports actually increase user tracking via various mechanisms. We added information describing the threat to user data in the server, because again, there could be additional information if it's come over a transport that has tracking elements. We talked about threats to being able to authenticate servers over encrypted transports, and blocking of encrypted transports. So the question at this point is, if there's been some very positive feedback about adopting this document, and so if that's the case, how does the working group want to move forward? So what's missing, or what still needs work in there? One question is the coverage of the encrypted transports sufficient? Bigger questions are, should the scope of this document actually be expanded, given that new questions are being raised about threats to users based on their choice of resolver and the network context that they're in? Now, whether or not this document is the right place for that, I don't know. I think that's a decision for the working group to make. We're also seeing work on discovery mechanisms. So we should, as those progress, we should probably include how users assess and choose which discovery mechanisms to rely on. I think that is something that does fit here at some point in the future. And as a last question, there's a lot of talk about where should lots of different discussions go? Should there be a new working group that's focused more on policy and deployment, and DPRIVE should remain looking much more at the protocol level? And if that were the case, would this move to that sort of working group? So that's a much longer term, much more open question. So that's everything for today on this draft. I don't know, I'm happy to take questions on this now, or I can go on and talk about the operations draft and take questions at the end, which seems like the more sensible thing to do. Okay, in that case, I will.
People like what they see. Okay.
Good.
Here we go.
Okay, thank you.
Keep talking, Sarah.
So the companion document to the problem statement is the solution, which is the best practices for operators who are offering at least one privacy-preserving protocol. When we started on this document originally, we had two goals. One was to describe the operational policy and security considerations for operators using the transport. And the second was to think of a way that operators could publish and communicate what policies they are at and practice they are using in practice to users to help with informed user consent. So the document is actually split into two sections along these two lines. Where are we with this draft? The last time we presented this was back in Montreal, because there wasn't a meeting in Bangkok. It was adopted by the working group very shortly after that. And we've currently on the O2 revision, which came out just in March this year. But I would say there's been no major changes since it was adopted back in August. So I'm going to just quickly run through the document structure so that people get a flavor of what's in here if you haven't read it for a while. So in part one of the document, where we talk about the considerations, we frame those within three contexts. One is on the wire, so between the stub and the recursive. The second one is in the server, so we're talking about data at rest. And the third one is upstream, so that's messages on the wire to authoritative and sharing data with third parties. And so what we do in the document is for each of those contexts, we enumerate the set of threats that there are, and then we recommend mitigations. And in the current document, the threats are taken both from the 7626 BIS and from the privacy considerations for protocol development document 6973. And then there's a few others which are actually standalone. Then for each of the mitigations, we've broken them down into three sets. So we say that we've labeled them as mitigations, which are things that you shouldn't be running what you're calling a DNS privacy service unless you are doing this set of things. So that's the minimal you can do to be compliant. The second is optimizations, which are things that improve the position for your users. And then the additional options is like the full Monty of this is everything you could possibly do to really bling up your service. So it doesn't correlate exactly to a traffic light, but that's one of the places we could go with it. Eka?
Yeah, so are you saying that you shouldn't be running a dot or DOS server unless you do these things, or maybe you shouldn't call it a privacy service?
you shouldn't promote it as a privacy service unless you're doing the minimal set.
Okay, because I'm sure we agree that like it'd be better, the world would be better if people had the same cruddy like data policies they have now, but like ran. Okay.
Yeah, because if all you do is take what you have and just toggle TLS on, that doesn't make you a privacy service.
No, but it does make the world a better place, right?
Yeah. Okay, so to quickly spin over some of the things that fall into the categories. So in the on the wire section, we consider both protocol and service. So we talk about your protocol selection, we talk about ensuring you offer a way for users to authenticate your service and the varying ways you can do that. We talk about certificate management because that's new to DNS. We talk about protocol things you can do between the stub and the recursive. So should you pad things? Should you do session resumption? Should you do cookies? Or if you do any of those, you shouldn't require the client to do it. They can opt out. And we also talk about ensuring your service is equally available on clear text transports and on encrypted transports. So servers aren't at a disadvantage if they choose to use an encrypted transport. At rest in the server, the focus here is really on primarily it's data minimization. It's don't store anything you don't need to anymore if you're a privacy service. And then if you do have to store stuff, how do you handle it? So we talk a little bit about trying to maximize monitoring to be transient so that you don't, you could do stuff potentially in memory and not even save it to disk. We talk about logging, and if you are going to log, please anonymize it as much as you possibly can. Don't use the data that you have to track or correlate users across other services that they might use from the same endpoint. Being very aware as who has access to the data, and we have what's rather a placeholder for defenses against cache snooping. In terms of the data sent upstream, so we talk about what recursors should be doing in terms of protocol. So you should be doing key name minimization. You should be very careful about how you do ECS if you do it. You could run local route, etc. We briefly talk about how you might want to employ traffic obfuscation, particularly for privacy services with a small subset of users, and how you can then let your users hide in the noise of upstream traffic. And we go on again to talk about data sharing, and there is a fair amount of commonality with the at rest, but there are some things that are also specific to sharing data. The second part of the document is the policy and practice statement. And this is nothing more than a framework that we are proposing for a way for operators to publish the decisions that they have made about their service. It's not huge. At the moment, what's in there is about 2.5 pages of text. It's just a list of, you should say something about this, something about this, something about this. What we hope is the usefulness of this is that it will allow operators to publish their data and their policies in a similar way to provide consistency of representation for users who want to consume or analyze this. Now, there's several hours and days of my life I will never get back from sitting and reading policy statements from just the big 3 quad services. Trust me, my guess was I read about 5,000 lines of texts in over 20 different locations in order to track the chain of policies that tell me exactly what is going on. So it is non-trivial for even a technical user to get a really clear picture of the comparison of these services. So we've heard a lot of times this week, informed user choice and consent is really important here. So one of the goals of this is to enable that by collating information in a common form from users. And we also think that this is the best way to provide the basis for external audits, which are another key element in terms of, I'm an operator, I say I do X, how do you know I really do? So this would be the basis of an evaluation or monitoring, ideally, if you can actually do it via monitoring rather than requiring an audit. So as an exercise to this end, we tried to use the proposed framework and we tried to look at the privacy policies of 4 providers. When we originally did it, Google didn't do DOT, they do now, and OpenDNS doesn't do DOT, but obviously Cloudflare and Quad9 do, but it was just let's mix and match and see how useful this is. We used to have some results in the document, but because of the table structure in a document, we just found we couldn't display it properly here. So we've actually moved the results onto DNS privacy. But there's a link in the document to this work. And at this point, it's research that's informing how we do the framework and will not necessarily be in the document when it's published. But to give you an idea of how you transform 5,000 pages of text into an analysis of the policies, we have two tables on the website. The first one is the policy comparison. And apologies that this probably does still really look small, so grab the slides and have a look or go to the website. But what we want users to be able to do is look at information like this. And here we compare, Quad 9 actually offered two services with different characteristics on different IP addresses. We've got Cloudflare's Dot and Do, and we've got Google and OpenDNS. So, for example, you can just go, oh, right, who are the partners of the person I'm sending my DNS data to? And can I even find out what they are? Are they stated anywhere? Or what does this operator do in terms of filtering? Where's the statement for that? So I can just pick and choose very easily based on my requirements. Similarly, there's a practice comparison. So again, the same services. And it's quite interesting to skim this and, and see things like, you know, at a glance, who is doing DNSSEC? Not everybody, interestingly. Who is doing query name minimization? And some of these things we can actually test for by monitoring. And the ones that we can test for, so again, going back to the idea that these tables are still complicated and you still need some technical know-how to read them. But once you've gone from text to tables, you could in principle translate this to a traffic light system, which we could summarize, you know, each one of these falls into a category about their level of compliance. And it feels like that might be useful information to convey to users. So as I said, some of these things we can monitor, some we can't. Again, at dnsprivacy.org, we have a monitoring test suite set up in Jenkins, where down the side we list all the dot resolvers. At the moment it's limited to dot, all the dot resolvers that have been stood up. And so whenever people just stand up dot servers, they tend to get in touch with us and say, can you publish my details on your site? Because at the moment that's the best out of band way to publish things like IP addresses and credentials. So down the side, we have various servers, including the ones run by the Stubby developers, Quad 9, Google, and Cloudflare. And across the top, we have a set of tests. A subset of these are things that we are recommending are part of the policy statement, but we test for some other things here too. So you can see, if I highlight one row there, that's Quad 9, Google, and Cloudflare. And going across the way, we look at, do they offer TLS? Do they offer it on port 443? Can I authenticate the name they publish? Do they provide SPKI PIN? Is their certificate currently valid? Do they do QName minimization? Do they do DNSSEC? Do they do Keep Alive? Do they pad their answers? Do they do TLS 1.3? Do they do out-of-order responses? So wherever we can, we're trying to do that. And what we haven't found yet is any discontinuity between what these operators say they do and what the subset of things we can probe for. Aka.
Yeah, I mean, this is cool. I'm just wondering, I saw that in the previous thing you had, so these, just to be clear, these like red exclamation points are not, they're lying, but this is bad. They're not doing it and this is bad, right?
Or just not necessarily just that they're not doing it. They might say we're not doing it.
Right, okay,
yeah.
Right.
So
but,
it's just a,
right.
Yeah.
Okay, so, right, but I mean, but the implicit thing is like, we think that that's not good because like the red exclamation point, like, it's like, this is bad, right? Yeah. So I guess I was wondering how you're going to handle perhaps more neutral properties such as blocking, right?
Yeah.
So I mean, like, you know, because like that's just a different table that is like more like figure out for yourself.
Yep. So what we were thinking of doing is evolving this and splitting it out into the set of things that would map to what's in the compliance, and trying to do that. But as you say, some things we will have to be very careful with because they're subjective, you know. So this is that there's the other things we can monitor. I think they fall into two categories. There's the from a protocol perspective, you should be doing this.
Yes.
And then there's a, what is your service policy? And let's just reflect it so people can make a informed choice without us necessarily saying it's good or bad. So
Right.
I think
Yeah. I guess I would actually suggest that there are perhaps a slightly different autonomy, which is so there's the things you like let's ignore the things that we have disagreement on whether they're good or bad. You know, so it's like the stuff on this list, right? Where I think we all basically agree that like you should do these things. It seems like basically you know, there's the policy. What does the policy say? There's what do they actually do? And like, and then did they disagree, right? And so like the you know, so I guess and qualitatively, like they like the policy doesn't reflect like the if the policy doesn't reflect actual behavior, it's like super bad, right?
That's when the red flag should go
I mean, it's like much worse. It's like, you know, okay, if you say you do TLS-23 and you don't, that's like much worse than like if you just don't do it, right? Which is like actually like understandable. So yeah, I guess like I think that maybe that's the way to think about it, is like the sort of three tables. And I think maybe there's a fourth table, which is here are some things which you might or might not want, and this is who does them and who doesn't, right? Like, so I mean, like I think a great example is the blocking, where like Quad 9 offers blocking as a non-blocking service, and you know, maybe you want blocking, maybe you don't, but like that's up to you to decide. We don't tell you which one you want to do.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you. That's a really good idea. We'll do that with this table. One thing to say is that this table is generated off a single vantage point, which is the Synodon office in Oxford. So it's, you know, it's certainly possible that you might get different results if you're looking from different places. So one thing we were literally talking about in the break beforehand is what would be also really nice is a tool a bit like the internet.nl connection test page, but extended to probe from your device across to multiple resolvers on multiple transports, and see what you get back, and, for example, compare answers to see, you know, if you talk to, as we saw on the network, if you talk to Quad 8 over UDP, do I get the same answers as if I talk to it over TLS? Because I know nobody's messing with the TLS ones if I authenticate the far end. So I think that would be a nice thing to also work through, so that you could validate some elements of what you think, what service you think you're getting on the local network. Stephen.
Stephen Farrell, just on the last point Echo made there, I mean, I think there's more than one category of blocking. Some of, you know, there's a category that you might kind of opt into, and then there's another category that you mightn't even be told about. So I think that I'm not sure how you could possibly distinguish those things, but not conflating them would be good.
But, I think also thinking about it, even if a operator says, we block these kinds of things for you, detecting that they comply to the way they say they block is really tough, because that's a hard space to probe.
Yeah,
so we'd have to think about how do you go about doing that.
Like, I don't think it maps into a traffic light type thing, right?
Probably no, I don't think it does. I think it's a data gathering exercise.
Hi, Jeff Hodges. With respect to the client side probing that you were talking about, take a look at Netalyzer at Berkeley.
Yeah.
There might be synergy there.
Thank you. Okay, so to wind up and come to the open questions about this document, the most comments we got the last time we presented this was around the structure of the document. Should it stay a single document? Should we split out the data handling, because that's possibly a gnarlier problem than just describing what you should do in terms of protocols on the wire? And should we actually split the policy framework out into a separate document, because that's a standalone thing? And what we heard was support for doing both things on both questions. So none of that actually ended up coming to the list. So if you do have opinions, please bring it to the list so we can make a decision there. Some of the other questions are about the scope of this document. Even since we started writing it, that's possibly changed. Should we have more detail in this document about, if you're an operator and you're a DNS resolver and a CDN, here's some things you should and shouldn't do. Or if you're just handling, for example, DOE traffic and other traffic at the same endpoint, here's some things you should and shouldn't do. So it's possible there's ideas on that should go in here. And I guess in terms of moving the document forward, I think that the chairs might want to comment on this as well. Since the last update that we did in the middle of last year, there's been very little discussion on the list about it. I mean, so the question is, are we done, or do we just not think this is fit to be a document? It should stagnate for a while. It's currently designed to be a BCP. Should we think about parking it as an informational document instead? I don't think what's clear is what the working group actually wants to do with this going forward. So
Yeah,
maybe that's a
that
question.
was my thought too.
Yeah,
Do
okay.
we feel like we have enough data to sort of make it a BCP type document?
I mean, we've always said it would be a living document. It's going to be very dynamic. So, I mean, there was a question about it becoming a draft in the first place. So if people have ideas
We'd love to hear from folks.
on what we should do with it, please take it to the list, I think. Any other questions? Or are we? Yep.
Yeah.
I think this is, I mean, needs to be settled with the open questions, but I think having a BCP on this is valuable to the community, which is why my name's there too. I hope I'm not like opening the can of worms, but clarity from us about BCPs are for clarity about us, from us about the value of some operational decisions. And I don't see a reason why this group can't be involved in one of those. Oops, sorry.
Wow, I get to raise the mic. That doesn't usually happen. Yeah, Rich Sauls, Akamai. Yeah, I'd love to see some advice for CDNs, speaking as one. BCPs are like a point in time statement, right? And what's best changes over time. I think this is like a brilliant document. I can't imagine the effort that went into it and reading all that legalese. So thank you very much. And yeah, let's move it forward.
Thanks.
Joe Abley, PIR, I also think it's good and it should be published. But I think one of the reasons for that is that it defines some terms that are useful to cite. So when it defines, for example, levels of compliance or whatever you call them, and the degree to privacy, the degree of privacy afforded in 3 levels, that is an interesting thing to be able to cite and refer to because you can use that in protocol signaling. So I think it's worth publishing.
Okay, thank you.
Dan York, Internet Society, but not speaking for them. I too support doing something with this document. I think it's very good guidance. I would though suggest I'm in the camp of splitting out the DPPPPPPS thing because it's a different audience. Because I know, having worked with our lawyers, et cetera, around writing privacy policies and so on, that's the people who will consume some of that. So if you can say to them, we want one of these, go look at this document, here's the guidance for how to write this. The lawyers or others engage with that probably will not want to weed through all the other 18 pages worth of operational guidance to get to the point where they have the part they have to care about.
Right.
So I would suggest that, and then, there could be references between them or whatever.
Yeah, so maybe publish them as a pair of documents together.
Yes, yeah, so they could reference each other or something on that line.
Yeah.
Christian Wittemar, that's a nice document, but some of the discussions, like the discussion on how to use TLS and how to not leak information through TLS, are also client-side recommendations. And it'd be nice if we had this client-side recommendation, as in, for example, clients should be very careful with using session resume and things like that. And basically, and the server recommendation should be essentially, don't break the clients that are taking care of themselves.
I agree, and for a while we've been talking about doing the client companion to this. And I think now would be a good time to start that document. I think there's quite a bit of overlap with Vittorio's draft, and depending on, I'm interested in working group's view on that because that's very prescriptive almost in how to do certain things. And I think if you're talking about a client, and if you go down the road of doing a client BCP, you probably want to include information to help clients choose their resolvers.
Yeah, and it's not.
And then it gets a bit more subjective.
In all those documents, especially on the client, I wonder how much should be prescriptive and how much should be descriptive? As in,
Exactly. Yeah.
if you're worried about this, you should do that.
Yeah.
Etc.
Yeah. Because I mean, we have a document that describes the protocol profile for a client, but not necessarily the more subtle considerations about what to do to a given resolver on a given network.
Yeah.
So I think there is a document there that could be written. Thanks.
Alex Mayo for Nick.at. I have a different kind of question, and that is, at which point would we actually decide to move such documents to DNS op? So when does encrypted DNS become the normal standard? Yeah. Once we are done with the definition of the core protocol, because I don't see anything in DNS op that precludes us from sending encryption-related documents.
You just
there. I know
broken Tim's heart.
It's like barking up the same tree. Yeah.
So now that you've broken my co-chair,
It's okay. We can discuss it next time. Go ahead.
so it's. I think what I heard is a couple of things. I'll get to Alex's question in a second. It seemed like there's interest in splitting out the policy things, which makes a lot of sense, and we can make a consensus call on the mailing list about that. And I also heard wanting to add some CDN content. Are you interested in soliciting people to actually help provide that, or do you have a good grasp on what that might look like?
Not yet, no. So if people have opinions or text, please send.
Okay, so those of you from the CDN world who would like to see that kind of content in here, please get a hold of the authors. And then on the topic of moving any of this to DNS op, so at a minimum, I think once we split this out and we have a BCP that we're happy with as a DPRIVE working group, the easiest thing to do is actually just ask for review in DNS op and make sure that that's a part of the review process. But keep the document ownership here so that the people who are most interested in DPRIVE are the ones who are involved in the development of that document.
Because there is a comment in the document that says, even though in terms of the data handling, this is within the scope of privacy services, these should actually be considered to be done for any DNS operator. So there is an overlap there, and I guess that's maybe the point at which does DNS op want to decide they want to start specifying some of these as recommendations for all operators.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point to point that out to DNS op and see if it's something they want to take up.
Yep. Okay.
Any other questions on the biz or the BCP, Watson?
So I sent a small email to the working group with like some small textual comments. My bigger question is, shouldn't this be for all DNS operators?
Yep. I mean, there are some protocol elements in here that are specific to encrypted protocols. Everything in here that isn't limited to an encrypted protocol, you could absolutely argue that.
Well, I think we should go one step further. I think we should say that every DNS operator should be using encrypted protocols.
So that was another question. With regard, so it came up slightly the other day in the context of the TCP requirements, implementation requirements. Should TLS or other protocols be a must implement, should implement for operators? So again, that's maybe something for DNS op. So, thank you. Ooh, one last.
EKR, you have like Eric? He talks fast.
I was just going to say, I was going to say that probably seems like a 6919 must, but we know you won't.
Yeah. Looks like that's it.
That's it.
All right. So while our next speaker is making their way up here, what I would like to do is ask for any volunteers who would agree to do a review of this document in the next, say, month, so that Sarah has a good set of input from. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Vittorio Bertola. I'm still an IETF newcomer, so just to give you an idea of where I'm coming from, so to explain why maybe the document is built in a certain way. I was involved for like 20 years in the rest of the internet governance places like ICANN and so on, but still here I am a newcomer, and I was told that to start a discussion I have to write a draft, and so this is what I did. And actually, I started from the same consideration that was already done, so that I saw this best practice document for the operator side of operating DNS privacy services. But I mean, going throughout the DOH discussion, it appeared to me that there's a lot that needs to be discussed from the client side. And so I said, why don't we try to start writing advice and best practices for the people that write the DOH and DOT clients? And so, I mean, this is the approach that I've taken. So I tried basically to take the other document as a starting point and do something similar but aimed at client applications. So this is, in a way, it's complementary, but it's pretty different from the other two DOH drafts that were presented in the DOH group, which were written by operators trying to document their own concerns, their own problems. I mean, the idea was to try to have a write-down of all the issues that have been reported by different parties. Of course, no one really agrees on all of them, so some argue that these are not issues, but still, first of all, I wanted to write them down, and then maybe trying to see whether there can be any shared, if possible, advice on how to deal with some of them and deploy DOH in a way that is acceptable to everyone and solves, at least as far as possible, some of these issues. And since I think at this point of the discussion, more or less everyone agrees that the problems derive from the deployment policies more than from the protocol itself. I think this is why some best practice on how to deploy this is necessary. So this is absolutely not meant to stop the deployment of encrypted protocols. Actually, I think that in the long term, and I mean, I agree with what was being said, that in the long term, everyone should just be running encrypted DNS. And so the point is rather that I see some resistance to the deployment of encrypted DNS transport exactly because of some of the issues. So I think that if we find a way to address them and make everyone more or less happy, or at least less unhappy about this, it will be easier to get it deployed. And also, this is in the end, I mean, the document was not meant to tell a single side or to promote a single side of the story. So, of course, this is just mine. I'm sure that there's a lot of stuff in it that doesn't have consensus, and possibly it will never have. So, of course, there would be a lot of work to be done on this document to make it a consensus document. But I really tried to reflect the issues and also the advantages of the DNS encrypted protocols in a fair way. So if I failed, of course, I'm happy to take comments, but this was what I tried to do. And of course, I'm happy to incorporate other views and take authors and work on this. So, I mean, the document is structured as an advice to people that have already decided to deploy a DNS encrypted client. So this is why there is not an explicit recommendation on this, but I'm happy to take it. And the attempt is basically, well, first of all, to introduce a bit of terminology, because I think we still lack it. So there's still a discussion on how to call certain things. And then tries to break down the issues and organize them in some way. It's not entirely doable since many of these issues are connected one with the other. But then I try to write them up, I mean, give a write-up of the issue. And in the end, there are some recommendations. Which in some way, I mean, since, as I said, I come more from the policy side, I realize these are maybe more on the policy side than on the technical side. There are also some technical ones, but part of them could be too policy. So I mean, this is also part of the discussion. So, I mean, well, this is just an example. I don't know how many people here actually read the draft. Is like 19 pages, so it's not actually very short. So just to give you an idea of how this is structured, there's really a bit of terminology mostly related to defining terms like local or remote resolver and the different models of having name resolution happen at the network level or at the application level. And then this is the list of the issues that I found. Again, this is completely up for discussion, but I mean, I've seen another list of issues shown Wednesday at the side meeting, and I think it was incomplete. So if we take all the things that anyone has said about the problems that are being caused by the deployment of DOH and partly DOT, I think this is at least a starting list. Maybe there's more stuff than this. And so in the end, just to give you an example, this is more or less how the draft goes. So there's a description of the issue, an argument of the pros and cons, and in the end, some suggestions. This is paraphrased, it's not the actual text. a suggestion that applications should do certain things or should not do certain things, and so on. So this is more or less the bulk of the draft, and I encourage you to read it if you didn't. So, I mean, the point basically is, does this make any sense? So is this useful? I mean, can this be a way to further the DOH discussion in a productive way, rather than just continuing to argue one against the other and repeating the same things? And again, this is in the mandate for the IETF. Maybe part of it is, part of it is not. Maybe this could be focused more on technical stuff and the policy stuff could go elsewhere. But I'm happy to take feedback on that. And in the end, where do we go? And also, I think this discussion needs to be broadened. So, I mean, there are concerns expressed by people that are not technical and are not in the IETF. Maybe those are concerns that are not to be addressed at the IETF, but still, it's something that we have to discuss. So basically, this was just a way to throw a stone in the pond and get some waves and see whether I can get some comments. Thank you.
Eric Riscola. I don't know how long we have here. So, I mean, I think this does I think the introduction to this does a reasonably good job of like laying out the technical background of the situation. I like the distinction between application and network selection and application and network resolvers. I think this, the arguments about what's good or bad and the recommendations reflect one point of view that is not a consensus point of view, and I cannot imagine those getting any kind of consensus on IETF, so I'm not really sure what the point of the recommendations is. I can take it. I mean, like, go back to the previous slide, like, I can take issue with pretty much everything on that slide. I'm not sure that's helpful. I think I expressed my opinion pretty straightforwardly at the side meeting, though I suppose that wasn't formal, so I'm happy to do it here too. But yeah, I think, you know, some of these things I think are wrong. Some of the things I think are out of scope for IETF, but I don't think there's any, like, I think the idea that DPRIVE is going to come up with like a set of recommendations that, like, say, for instance, that applications shouldn't select their own resolvers is like a non-starter.
Yeah, by the way, I didn't plan to discuss the substance here because it would take like 2 hours, I guess, and it wouldn't lead anywhere. I think at this point in time, the feedback is really what you were giving. So, I mean, what could be in scope here and what would make sense?
I think you should trim this down to, I think this is a reasonably good layout of like the solution space and like the, you know, the things that might be making people upset. Though, as I expressed in the side meeting, frankly, any such document would also have to like also cover the things that are making people want to deploy. That precisely, like, there's a set of behaviors on the network that are causing people to want to deploy application level resolvers that do not get the resolver choice from the network. And like, if we're going to have a document that's going to have any kind of consensus, we'll surely have to cover that as well.
Yeah. Stephen? And I try to do that. Yeah.
So, Stephen Powell. So I agree with Ecker. I think that this seems to be it's a document written by somebody who has a problem with us doing what we're trying to do, I think. And that's not to say there are no such problems. But it's not it doesn't seem to me to be written as if it's trying to lay out an objective set of technical things that might be in a BCP. Yeah. So I think this, we had some discussion about DOE and so on. I hope the ISG are going to use their smarts to figure out a venue for that discussion. Nothing should be done with this except ignoring it until that discussion's happened and there's some more objective analysis done, I think.
Martin Thompson, I maybe would take a little issue with the actual implementation of the attempt at balance here. One suggestion that I would have perhaps is find someone who's planning to do this and get them on as a co-author, and you might have a chance of getting somewhere. One of the problems with this sort of approach to dealing with this situation is that it is very much like throwing stones. And one of the advantages of coming to something like this is that you can work with people who are on the other end of the debate and try to negotiate a situation where you have that balance. And I think this is a long way from being in that place. But I appreciate the attempt, and it's really good to see that the list of concerns being articulated, because I think a lot of the problems we've had in these debates is that there's always one more thing that pops up, and people are debating from a position of ignorance more than anything else, and I think this has done a lot to enlighten things. The fact that we haven't had the other side of this is a big gap. And I think we'll continue to have these long mic lines while we have that gap.
Yeah, if I may, by the way, of course, I would be happy to have someone with different viewpoints to join me and try to do a more balanced write-up. And I was also wondering whether it would be better just to not to have any recommendations and just to have write-up of the issues, which could be maybe a starting point for a subsequent discussion. So.
Stefan Bartmeyer. I'm a bit surprised by the choice of the specific example that you gave after the list of issues, the one with applications doing DNS, because it's something that is completely unrelated to privacy. So the question, is this in DPRIVE Charter? Then the answer is very simple, no, it's not. Now for the rest of the issues, I don't think there is. Well, the list is very long. Most issues are completely unrelated. And for the question, is this in the mandate of the IETF? The answer is it depends. A few are fully in the mandate of IETF because they talk about protocols. Some are partially in the mandate of IETF. For instance, applications doing their own name resolution is something that we could document this. We could document the consequences, flag maybe the risk, but we cannot mandate a specific behavior from application. So it's only partially. And some are really not in the mandate of IETF, and sometimes asking for consensus is completely unrealistic with some of this recommendation. You mentioned in one slide, no to alternative routes. Whoa, this is a very long discussion in IETF and other places, and I'm fairly certain that we will have no consensus on this one. So my suggestion is to split this in manageable issues, stop the laundry list approach with everything I can think about DO or DOT or DNS in general, and try to see for each issue if there is an issue. Most of the time, not everybody will agree there is an issue, and what the IETF can do: change a protocol, document a problem, but do it issue per issue, and not with long list of unrelated stuff.
Sarah Dickinson. Firstly, thank you for this document. I think it's a really good starting point for a discussion. And I think it's written in a really balanced way. I have two comments to make about it. One is that I think if we're going to go into this problem space, I actually think it's a two-dimensional problem. We have different classes of clients, and they can be human users and they can be applications. And then you also have the network context in which that client is. And I think the choices that get made are actually a decision of both of those factors. So in theory, we could expand this out across the other dimensions. So that's one comment to make about how we can gather all the information in one place. The other is, I wonder if this document might benefit from slightly restructuring in the same way as we did with the BCP, which is for each scenario, identify the threats and then have 3 levels of mitigations around the choices that you make. I would have to reread it again to see if it really could fit into that model, but that might be another way to give it some flexibility.
Watson, I must confess to only having briefly read it. I think the concrete recommendations that were made seemed fairly acceptable. I'm not sure why I disagree if people are disagreeing about that part. I do think the document gives more balance, but I also agree with Stefan's point that this is a broader issue which is being decided upon where the forum will be for all the DOH issues that have been raised. And I think this document is squarely going to fit there, not here.
Yeah, well, by the way, I start to think the same, especially after what I heard at the side meeting. So I have no problem if that's the conclusion. And of course, the attempt was to try to have just a general description. So I'm sure that not all of these issues pertain to privacy. So if there's another place where the discussion can be broader, because I think that in the end, the problem, however, is that some things that give you more privacy give you less of other things, and some things that alleviate the concerns on other things will give you less privacy, and so it's not so easy to separate the discussion. But, so thank you anyway for the comments, and the invitation for people that want to be co-authors, especially with different points of view, is still open. So even in the next few days, if someone wants to join, will be very welcome.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yes, Martin's comment was perfect. If there's somebody who wants to join him on that from the other side, that would be really great, I think. So. Sir.
Hey, morning, everyone. So I'd like to try to find a way to be able to kind of separate the requirement for DOT from DNSSEC in some way. So basically for what will happen with insecure delegations. And I'd like also to have some proper signaling that will make this sane. So I mean, both DNSSEC and DOT basically address different things. Everybody here will know. DNSSEC will give us integrity of the content that was given to us, but there is no privacy there. While DOT on the other hand will provide a privacy link to the peer we're talking to, but the data they give us may not be the actual right one. So Stefan in his draft about when he started detailing DOT from resolver to authoritative server mentioned using TLSA. In that case, basically you will go and get a TLSA record for the name server under _853._TCP.name server. And then either you get the full certificate or the SPKI, and then the resolver can actually validate that. So the authentication stays within DNS, which is a property that we may want to have. It works for cloud provider. What is called cloud provider here is essentially, suppose you get the zone owner example.com, and they may use example.net and example.org to serve their zone. And there may be a total disconnect between who the zone owner is and who the name server's owners are. Each name server can also handle its secrets on its own. So like if the example.net name server wants to change the key, want to rotate it, they can do it and they don't have to involve the zone owner. DNS is required, but it's only required at the name server level. So if example.com is handled by example.net and .org, example.com itself doesn't need to be signed. And it does involve an extra query. What was mentioned earlier on when it comes to discovery, then you will actually need to do an extra query here to find that the TLSA record exists. Another thing that comes to mind usually is to use the WebPKI and the X509 certificates. In this case, basically, you will just connect to the name server and you will get the certificate validating against the host name. That also works for cloud provider case because everybody handles their own certificates. And the thing is, in this case, DNSSEC is not required. There is no extra query because you get the certificate directly, but there is also no signal that DOT is actually supported in the first place. So you could easily block 853 and essentially make it look like the server doesn't handle DOT. And there is a reliance on the WebPKI, which is something that we may or may not want to have. So I started to think about maybe alternate ways we could do that. And I thought about the DSPKI, which is like DS, but for the SPKI. The rough idea here is basically you will have a new record type in the parent zone that will contain a hash of the SPKI of the name server. It also relies on the fact that the name server, the parent name server, is actually the TLD in most cases, is actually DNSSEC enabled. So this way you can validate that value. The issue here is pretty much it doesn't really work well with cloud providers because you got this DSPKI record that will say, oh, we support DOT, but then you may have one cloud provider that does support it and the other one that doesn't. So it's pretty much all of nothing. It's also these entities, external entities, have to sync up with the zone owner to be able to make any updates. On the other hand, there is no extra queries. There is signal that DOT is supported, and yeah, there is a new need. The cons are basically need for new R type and TLD change. But that started to also get some people mentioning that we could maybe overload the DS record type and basically have a new algorithm that will contain the SPKI hash. So this approach basically has the same trade-off, except that this time there is no need for a new R type. And then essentially we get into an issue where the zone owner is the one that can set value at the parent, but the name servers need to be able to change to rotate that certificate. So maybe something that we could call 9, so dog or whatever. We get so many of them, so one more, which is basically DS. And in this case, instead of having the SPKI of the name server in the DS record, we will basically hash the name server name itself. And this way you can get a signal that the name server supports DOT. So that adds signal to the X509 from before, but then essentially you still have the WebPKI issue. Finally, this was just a hack I did at the IETF104 hackathon, which was a DNS Curvish-like implementation where you will encode the SPKI hash into the name server. And this way, as you query the DNS record for example.com, you will get the name servers, and then you can get a signal that DOT is supported, and you get the SPKI hash. The issue is NS records are not signed, so whatever you get, you're not really sure. And here I'm trying to basically recap everything together in some kind of traffic light type of things. Whatever is red, I mean, there is no weight between these columns here, so some things may be bigger blockers than others, but that's kind of where the trade-off will be going depending on the approach. What I hope with that is basically, I mean, the original DSPKI approach made a few other people kind of bring ideas like the overloading DS and what we could do there, and if it would be possible or not, if that's technically possible. I've also heard that operationally may be hard to deploy because of restrictions from the registrars or from the way things are working at that level. But hopefully that's going to start, people are going to start discussing how we could solve that eventually. I'm not saying there is any good solutions here. There is going to be trade-off, and there is not going to be one solution that's going to fit everybody. But we essentially have to try to come up with where we want to make some compromise. And this is basically open for discussion.
Paul Hoffman, for your last row, SPKI and name, the red block under cloud provider support is only true if you use the algorithm you gave. Earlier, folks had just suggested not to tie in the name. It was there just the key, at which point a cloud provider could do that. But it doesn't improve it a lot, but it does remove one red block.
Okay, thanks.
Joe Abley, PIR. So I've got a question because I hadn't read your draft before, and I don't know much about X509. So is it the case that every time an individual name server operator wanted to roll a certificate for some reason, you'd need a change in the parent zone of every domain that used that name server?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, well, in the X509 case, no, because you're just connecting to the name server and matching the host name to the cert. But in the case of the DSPKI and the DS case, yes, because you're basically hashing the SPKI into the parent, so that may need to be updated.
So, I mean, I think, for example, in the org registry, the number of domains is much bigger than the number of name servers. So it suggests there's a lot of a small number of name servers serving a lot of zones. So potentially there's a lot of dependencies there. And because name servers are not really live actors in the ecosystem, there's no real way for them to publish their information other than, you might, for example, if you wanted to roll a certificate, you might have to go and persuade 10,000 people to all individually go and contact the registry, and they're not going to, and that's going to break things. So.
Totally agree, yeah. That's what was brought up.
Watson, I think there's two separate things that we shouldn't be conflating. One is signaling that you can do DOT, and the other one is authenticating. And so you can imagine just having a single bit field saying, yes, you can do DOT, and then separately having authentication. I think the X509, like DOT signaling, yeah, just doing X509 doesn't give you that. There's no reason you couldn't mix that in with some DNS level signaling or even remembering which name servers support it. There aren't, as someone suggested, there aren't that many name servers out there.
So the kind of DO9 will help with that. So you got the signaling, but that's from the parent. You get the signaling that DOT is supported, and then you can rely on the X509.
I'll need to think more. I need to think more about it. I think there's other ways to put in the signals as well.
Yeah, please bring it up on the mailing list.
Hello, Peter van Dijk, Power DNS. I really like DS and DO9. I've done some experiments to figure out if we can do those experiments. It turns out current resolvers are all compliant in that they go insecure on these unknown algorithms, except not resolver, which was fixed yesterday, and Google Public DNS, where my ticket is currently closed as works as intended. And I have Warren's attention, I see. Thank you.
Thanks for doing that. Actually, quickly, so one of the issues in the TLSA case is you can get some signaling, and basically you have to fall back to DNS over 53, and then you could find that there is TLSA record and know that they do that. There is also the issue that essentially you need to do some probing, but we could also think about a DS record that does signal that the server is supposed to do TLSA.
Wes Herdiker, ISI. The DNS ecosystem has a miserable history in keeping parent-children synchronization issues in check. And I would even so badly to the point of I would argue anything that requires a child to update a parent record is a non-starter. It's a real problem. And, unfortunately that might mean you need extra queries, as for example, but a lot of those solutions have parent-child synchronization issues, and we suck at it.
Yeah, this is something I brought up. Actually, in the case of the DO9, you still, at least the zone owner will need to update once to say that they support DS over X509. But then there is no need to update that as the name server doing the update. So that's kind of trade-off that may be fine. Yeah, I wanted to bring those different ideas. I think the table here should be maybe a bit more granular, and they should be also different shade of red and green.
Yeah, Welcome. I mean, the parent kind of child thing was pointed out enough. I mean, that's really a non-starter. Also, it involves registrars, registering, what have you. I think the solution has to be sort of somewhere at the child level so that the child can decide, and it has to be DNSSEC, period. I mean, we didn't do DNSSEC for years without kind of now doing something that doesn't require it.
Alex Mayover, something that came to my mind just a moment ago, I don't know whether it has been discussed, would be an EDNS 0 option in the additional section that gets returned to the client, though it would probably have other security implications.
That can be intercepted and dropped. That could be intercepted and dropped, right? All right, thanks. I mean, bring up your concerns and your ideas on the mailing list. I really want to, moving forward, I rather like to have more inputs to be able to try to find out where the trade-offs should be. Thanks.
This appears to be our last talk for the day, so.
Hello everyone, I'm Thiru. I'll be talking about bootstrapping the client to discover locally provided DOT and DOH servers. A quick problem statement on why we need to discover the locally provided DOT and DOH servers, and then the solution overview and the privacy and security aspects of it. Today, if in an enterprise network an endpoint is configured to use public DNS server, then it breaks split DNS, and it also breaks a local resolution and may or may not harm CDN localization to locate a CDN closer to the user geographic location. The bigger problem being the network security services deployed in the enterprise network cannot act on the encrypted DNS traffic to block malware. Today, what enterprise firewalls are doing are basically putting up ACL rules to basically drop any traffic going on port 853. And they have already identified a bunch of public DOH servers and are blocking access to those domains. These domains are categorized as proxy or anonymizer, and they block that. It has both security and privacy implications. That what it would cause is if the endpoint has chosen strict privacy profile, the endpoint can no longer get DNS service and cannot access internet, right? And if the endpoint has chosen opportunistic privacy profile, it would either fall back to clear text or end up doing unauthenticated encrypted connections. Both these scenarios have serious ramifications on the endpoint security and privacy. For instance, if the DNS traffic is successfully blocked, then it could result in pervasive monitoring. Typically, enterprises may have perimeter security, in which case an internal attacker can modify the DNS response to point to a malicious server. In case if the DOT or DOH traffic is not blocked, then split DNS may not work, and the network security service may be unable to block the malicious access to malicious domains. And further, if the IoT manufacturer is providing IoT firewall rules based on domain names, that cannot be enforced on the network security service. So what we're trying to propose in this draft is a mechanism for the endpoint to bootstrap and discover and authenticate the locally provided DOT and DOH server and solve the problems that I have previously listed. The assumption is in an enterprise network, if you bring a non-MDM device, MDM devices can easily be bootstrapped to trust the locally provided DOT or DOH server. This is a case where you bring in your own POD device into the enterprise network, in which case you know the credentials to authenticate to the network. So you basically discover and authenticate the EST server. EST is enrollment or secure transport. And then you basically authenticate the EST server using a PEG scheme. In this case, I picked augmented PEG scheme, basically TLS SRP, to authenticate the EST server. And once the authentication is successful, the endpoint can fetch the CA certificates and identity certificates, which is the DNS server certificate from the EST server. And what we have done is introduced a new SRV ID record, basically domain S, so that the client can identify among all the identity certificates what is the DNS server certificate.
Daniel Kahn Gilmore, can you just back up to that slide? Why is there a CA certificate involved in this?
Sorry?
Why is there a CA certificate involved in this?
The locally provided, the enterprise CA such.
But why do we need a enterprise?
To authenticate the DNS server, the local.
But why doesn't the local DNS server just have a normal certificate that doesn't use a CA certificate?
Many of the enterprises don't have public domains, basically.
So is the expectation that this CA certificate will be added to a generic root store, or that will be used specifically just to talk to this particular?
It's a name
DNS
restricted root CA just for authenticating the local provided services.
And is expected to not be added
Yes,
to the local root
it's not supposed to act as a TLS proxy to look into the internet traffic.
This strikes me as room for implementation error.
Yes, and that's what we're trying to avoid.
Right. So, like, whenever I see like a presentation that starts with some like really high level requirements, and then they starts like designing security protocols, I get kind of concerned. Can you like tell me what is the what information is this supposed to be establishing for me? Like I brought my client. It's like getting a bunch of network messages. Like, what information? What is the information I'm supposed to come away with?
So you just connect to an enterprise network, and for instance, like you get a message saying that I cannot use my public DOH or DOT server. Then what option do we have today? So to either it's fallback to clear text, right? So this is avoiding that option that you can have a secure connection to the enterprise provided DOT DOH server.
Okay, so I join the network. I get some messages that say, "Sorry, no default like DNS DOT server. Please go over here." Right?
Yeah.
What information? What is the security information that leads me to believe that the message "go over here" is valid?
Sure. So this information is going to come from an authentic source, because you know that that EST server, you're authenticating the EST server, right?
But,
using the credentials.
But the EST server, okay, like
so, unless you authenticate the EST server, it's a network provided EST server. It has the same. It should have a representation of your username and password. So it's talking to the AAA server hosted in the enterprise network. So it's a trusted element within the enterprise network. It's not some attacker who is hosting the EST server.
Okay. Wait. This is like, yeah, because like, this is like bananas.
Yeah, I think the question, like, if you envision like the generic MacBook I plug in to some random network, like I feel like there's a behavior switch between like generic public network behavior and managed enterprise network behavior. Are you presuming this is like a managed device? Yeah. Well, yes. So the question is like, how are you presuming the client figures out that it needs to be in managed enterprise mode as opposed to generic hostile internet mode? Are you presuming that there's like some switch or some device management platform there that like?
Yeah, it's a
explicitly
user
configures
choice.
this?
Basically, when he switches to this enterprise network, he can have a choice whether he wants to use the enterprise provided server or not. It's a choice for the user. I mean, he can always say
Okay,
that.
wait. Okay. Let's take a step back. Like, my first day at Cisco, I come in, I've got like my iPhone. I don't. It's enterprise managed device. So why don't you just MDM in the name of the server?
I'm talking about if it's MDM, it's pretty easy to manage. We don't need this, right? Let's make it very clear, right? I mean, if it's MDM, you don't need this mechanism basically.
But like he just told me it's not my generic device. So why can't whatever thing that imprints the device imprint it with the name of the server?
Yeah.
This is the thing that imprints the device. No, it doesn't happen at Starbucks. Okay, this is the thing that imprints the device. I don't know why we can't do it at Starbucks, except that we haven't agreed.
This is a
to let Starbucks do
non-MDM,
this.
non-IT managed device that I take to Cisco office and I want to log into Cisco's network,
That's right.
That's the scenario basically.
In that context, how do you get the DOT, DOH trust anchor so that you can get DNS?
Right.
Okay. Again, it's not really clear to me why these can't have like web PKI certificates. But okay, fine. So, is there a mechanical wired communication path yet? At the point where this starts, is there a wired communication path with some trust information on the client or not? The answer is no. The answer all there is a password.
The user has already authenticated to the network. This is the next step after that.
Oh, yeah. I was thinking, like, how, I'm trying to understand, I don't know what the scenario is. The scenario is that this is like a device which already has a management platform that is communicating with it or not. So then I don't understand, like, okay.
Hi, Watson here. Why are you using SRP for this?
It's TLS SRP.
I know the thing is, I believe that version of RFC is a version of the protocol which has a 2-for-1 password guessing attack. There's also issues around the password hashes they recommend. A lot more needs to be there in security considerations. And I'll advise you to wait for a CFRG or TLS working groups to have a modern PAKE. Something like OPAKE could probably even remove a couple of rounds by sending the information you want in the blob in the first place.
Yeah, I'm following the work in CFRG. So this was something that was available on OpenSSL for me to prototype. So that's the reason I picked it up.
I'm aware it's available on OpenSSL. There have been a history of issues here.
Sure.
And I would strongly advise you not to use that implementation.
Okay.
Stephen Farrell, and then Warren, and then Richard Barnes is the last person in line. So Richard, stand there. You'll be the end. Okay.
Stephen Farrell, I share Ecker's puzzlement on this one. Would it be fair to say that you're a bunch of people who are used to dealing with EST and you already had a hammer? So would that be fair or unfair?
Yeah, enterprise networks use EST server all the time. So yeah.
Right. Yeah. Seems weird to kind of use that kind of enrollment kind of model to try and solve the problem of issues with DOE bypassing local policy. That just seems like a really weird thing to try to do.
So Warren Kamari, Google. I think just like Stephen and Ecker, I'm very confused in the sort of deployment model. I arrive at business with phone and it helps me enroll in this. What I do not understand is how the same thing can't happen at, a Starbucks or something like that, right? How does my device know that this is one it's supposed to enroll with and that's okay and reasonable, and that other one isn't? And I think that that's at the root of a lot of the confusion.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to do this procedure if I walk into Starbucks, but I want to do it if I go into my enterprise network, right, where I work.
But how do you know that that's the good one? And how does your
I'll
device
talk
know
about
that's
that.
the
I'll
safe
talk
one?
about that if you can give me a second. Yeah, sure.
Paul Wouters by that. So this problem is basically orthogonal to the VPN client that connects remotely to the network and then also needs to convey some DNS information and what is trusted or not. And in that case, it's the easy case because you actually have provisioned and pre-installed a trust relationship between the two parties.
Yes.
And even there, I spent 4 IETFs and some interesting long-term quality time with Ecker on getting a split DNS draft out there, which is now an RFC last call. I strongly recommend you read all the limitations that were enforced on us to limit these kind of scenarios where you just take over a DNS server so that you don't waste as much time as I did in getting people happy here about reconfiguring their DNS on the fly.
Yeah, I'm following the IPsec. Yeah, thanks.
Matt Poundset, could you actually back up to your problem statement slide? Yeah, that one. So, so I'm going to observe that I'm actually on the opposite side of these enterprise case argument as a lot of the privacy people who are here. In that I think we need to solve the enterprise issue. But I think you're starting from a malformed problem statement, which might be part of the reason why everybody's confused. So network security services can act on, or rather don't need to, how do I find the right way to phrase this so that it covers both these cases. Network security services don't need to treat DOT and DOE differently necessarily. The reason they're different is that DOE is designed to bypass that sort of thing, right? So conflating them in that way is problematic. Number one, in that we don't actually want to prevent people from using DOT and DOE. We want people to use our DOT and DOE, right?
Yeah, I'm just saying this is what is happening in the enterprise firewall world, and I'm saying rather than, and today the entire mechanism is causing the endpoint to fall back to clear text because you cannot reach, and I'm saying this is a better proposal than what is happening today.
Right, right. But the conflict here is between the user who either trusts DHCP or they don't, and if they don't, then they're treating the network as hostile, and between the network administrator who looks at the application as either they accept my DHCP data or they don't, and if they don't, that application is hostile. And you're not going to solve that second case through configuration. And in the first case, you're not going to solve that through more management configuration. You have to solve that through some sort of other trust relationship, so you need prior trust, which basically boils down to the application is either going to accept DHCP or they're going to manually configure something with some kind of prior trust agreement. And so I think however you approach this, because the problem statement isn't quite right for what's actually going on, you're going to wind up with something that nobody really gets.
Okay.
Richard Barnes from Cisco. So I think what we have here is a tussle. So I mean, I think to your credit, I think you have accurately described the state of the art in terms of where we stand in this tussle. I think the challenge, I'll be brief because I think a lot of people have said this pretty clearly. Like I think there is a use case here. Like there's a pony somewhere in here. The trick is like figuring out exactly where in this use case space you land in a territory that's not already occupied, right? Because we understand two cases pretty well. We kind of nailed down two ends of the spectrum. We understand the totally unmanaged device and whatever the hell it wants pretty well. And we understand the managed device with an MDM platform that is explicitly configured by the owner of the network to do the right thing. Right. We understand those two cases. And I think there's this ambiguity of like where, if you plop down somewhere in the middle of this, where like the network is trying to impose some control and there's a need to opt into some, like how do you, end up in that situation and not kind of fall over into one of the others. So like putting some bounds on this situation would help, and maybe like thinking about what the user experience is you're trying to create would be helpful.
Sure.
you have like 2 minutes left.
Sure. So after the DNS servers are discovered, the client can do an SNAPTR lookup to figure out the protocols being supported by the local server, and then the order of preference provided by the DNS server administrator. For DNS over HTTPS, the existing working group draft in DOH can be used to discover the URI template. The client can then use the explicit trust store downloaded from the ESG server to validate the server certificate. We're considering adding a new privacy certificate extension to basically convey the privacy policy with regard to the DNS server. What's it going to do with the data, especially the PII data, just like the public servers are giving a policy. So this is going to reflect the privacy policy of the local DOT DOH server so that the user can make an consented choice whether he wants to use this locally provided DOT DOH server or not. The explicit trust store can also be used to validate other DNS server sec lookups that happen within the local network. And user just needs to, I don't want to enable this in every network, so I go to a network where I work day in and day out, and I know that, hey, that network gives me network security and privacy, and I want to use that in those networks only. And if the user trusts the networks, then the user can enable a strict privacy profile, unlike the today's configuration where user typically goes by a default opportunistic privacy profile, which causes him to fall back to clear text. And any further comments and suggestions? Thank you.
So how many people have actually read this document? Of those of you who have read this document, how many of you think that this is actually in scope for this working group?
Yeah.
Okay. 2 seconds, Richard.
Yeah, without looking at the charter, it seems like this group has done some thinking about discovering, DNS servers that provide these security enhanced features, and so to that degree it could be in scope, but I don't think we understand the use case here quite well enough to say one way or the other with any finality.
Hold on, Martin. Is Barry still in the room?
No.
Oh.
We chased him off.
Okay. Martin, go ahead.
Yeah, Martin Thompson. This has got some parallels to the work that Paul's doing for discovery and DOE. It's a little unclear how the two interlock, and it also could be a completely different mechanism. And I suspect that we'll need to understand the requirements a lot better before we can decide whether this is even remotely the right mechanism. This is a frightening mix of acronyms from my perspective, and I can imagine a number of solutions that are far simpler, but I don't know what the requirements are.
All right, so in full disclosure, I was calling out Barry because he and I actually had a conversation about some of this discovery and how he wanted to deal with it from an IETF perspective. So for those area directors who are still in the room, Warren, Eric, anybody else I need?
So Sean, no.
No, not Sean. No.
Not yet.
But if you guys can help coordinate that effort with the different working groups related to the DNS over, pick your favorite transport protocol, and let us know, that would be great. All right, we are now 3 minutes over. Unless somebody has something critical, like your hotel room is on fire, and you want to let everybody know.
No, we're done. We're done, and the IETF is over. I think this is the last. Thank you for sticking around so long, guys. And we'll see y'all probably in Montreal.
And
maybe even West Virginia.
Let's not get carried away.
Let's not get carried away. Oh, where are the blue sheets? Oh, I see them. Just leave them back there. I'll come get them. So. Oh, yeah, I got them. Sure. Yeah. Yeah, it's better if I get moving. When I sit, my leg starts to get all tight. I'm going to go upstairs. We're going to have lunch, I think. Gino and I, if you want to join us, I'm buying. Probably not right away because I'm going to talk to some ICANN people. Okay. So I need to talk to my camp people too about where I went. Oh, he's back from some place.